Starting in Genesis chapter 18 and 19. Genesis 18 and 19 basically tell one main event that took place here during the time of Abraham while he was in Canaan. And so in Genesis 18 and 19, if you were to sum up in 2 words, how would you sum up Genesis 18 and 19? It's probably there. That's more 19, if I said 19. Sodom and Gomorrah, except that's 3 words. Sodom and Gomorrah. Because you would have caught me on that. The events that lead up to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, beginning in chapter 18, verses 1 and 2, again, I'm going to throw a lot of questions out as we're looking through the text to see what takes place. And so in the first 2 verses, there are 3 men that appear and come to Abraham. And who are these 3 men? And I will say that in verses 1 and 2, it doesn't really tell us who these men are, but I think most of us are familiar enough with this text that we have an understanding of who these 3 men are representing. Who are these 3 men? Who would you say they are? Okay, angels. What's another word for angel? Messenger. We know that they are sent from God. We know that one of them is going to be referred to, Abraham is going to refer to him as Jehovah here in these chapters. And so, but we know these 3 men are messengers from God. They're bringing a message from God. And so the main message that they have, look down in verses 9 and 10. The main message that they have is something concerning Sarah. And so as they come, of course, Abraham, he makes sure that they're going to prepare a meal. This was just culture of that age, that as they come up, any visitors come up, it is the responsibility of the homeowner to provide for visitors. And so they're going to provide for them, be hospitable to them. But as they're sitting there with Abraham, they have a message concerning Sarah. What is that message? She's going to have a child. When? Within a year. By this time next year, Sarah will be with child. And so it's a prophecy. Again, back to our puzzle pieces, it's another little piece that is put into the whole story of what's going to take place. God has been promising. He hasn't said what exactly yet, but he's been telling Abraham and Sarah. He was saying, no, it's not going to be Eliezer, your servant. No, it's not going to be Hagar and her son. I've got another plan. And so now we see that this plan is a little more specific in what God is promising. What was Sarah's reaction in verse 12? She laughed. And I hear people talk about this in different ways, that of a laughter of, that's ridiculous, I can't believe that type of laughter. There are some that look at it from a perspective of almost a joyful laughter, neither one of them could believe it. I mean, it's so hard to at their age to believe that this was going to happen. And they even asked, well, why did Sarah laugh? And so you can see the humanity in Sarah, in just trying to come to grips with what is being said and what's being promised here. Now, this was not the only mission that these men came for. What was the other mission that these 3 men had come to accomplish? Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a judgment. God is going to bring judgment upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, this would be important to Abraham for what reason? Okay, Lot. He has family that lives in Sodom. And so they come and they share with Abraham what they're about to do, what's about to take place. And two of the men then leave and go to Sodom, and there's one that stays behind with Abraham. And in verses 23 through 33, if you could sum up the conversation that Abraham has with God. Abraham's going to make an appeal to God, to the Lord, it says, to Jehovah. What is the appeal that Abraham makes? Okay. So Abraham starts kind of bargaining with God. He starts with 50. If you find 50 righteous people in the city, will you not destroy the city? Okay, if I find 50 in the city, I will not destroy the city. Well, what if you found 40? And he continues to go back and forth with God until they get to 10. And if there are 10, and God says, if there are 10, I will not destroy. We see in verse 32, God says, yes, I will grant you their safety if there are 10 righteous. And so that tells us, being that we know the end of the story, that there weren't 10 righteous in the city. And so what happens now, this is starting chapter 19, starting in verse 1 down through verse 11. What happened that night in Sodom? As these two come into the city, just in a brief summary of what happens that night. Okay, we have these men that come. It looks like there is a sexual intention that they have with these two men of God, these messengers of God. And it's Lot that pulls them into his house, shuts the door. They're going to beat down the door. This whole scene is, I believe, shown to us because it just demonstrates how corrupt and how wicked the city really was. And so it demonstrates for the reader to be able to see this is why God is going to do what he's going to do. Because the wickedness will be punished, and it's not undeserved. It's not... There will not be any collateral damage of innocence in this judgment. And so that's just demonstrated in how perverse these men are acting. So beginning in verse 12 through 17, what did the men tell Lot? What was the main thing they said to Lot? Get out. Okay, get out. And while you're getting out, what were some of the instructions that were given? Okay, once you leave, do not turn back. Don't look back. And they tell him to go into the mountains and don't look back. And so they say he lets them know the city is about to be destroyed. And so you need to take your family and escape. However, Lot's wife, in verse 26, does what? She turns around and looks, and the consequence is she turns into a pillar of salt. And so it's accounts like this that I go back and I see, and here are those that are even trying to obey. They're trying to do what God has said. We're trying to do most of what God has said, but not all of it. And it's a reminder, and God does this all the way through the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. But it's all the way through the Bible that every single word that I have said is important. Everything that I've given you is important. And so we see these events that take place. Later on we'll see Nadab and Abihu use strange fire. And it's one of those things. They're worshiping God. They're making the offerings. they're doing those things they're supposed to, but they didn't do it exactly the way God said to do it. Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. They want to serve and they want to help, so they sell their land, but they lie to God about what they're giving. They did most of what they're supposed to, but not all of it. And every time it's a reminder of God saying everything is important. And so, again, we see it over. Some people look at these and go, how can a good God do something like this? And it's a complete misunderstanding of realizing this is what a good God does. A just and righteous God. If God says, do not look back, and then he allows them to look back with no consequences, then that just tells everyone else we can get away with stuff with God. We don't have to obey him. And it's just like a parent and a child. If you tell your child to do something and they don't do it, and you just overlook it and you don't deal with it, there's not consequences for that, the next time it's going to be even worse. And the next time it's going to be even worse. And I'm pretty confident we have all known of a situation where the children seem to be the ones that are in control because that authority was never established. And so that's what God is doing time and time again to demonstrate his authority. And he, of all people, has every right to demonstrate that authority, being the one that created each and every one of us. That's right. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, all these things that were written in past times were written for our learning. It's for the purpose of us being able to see we wouldn't know God and who he really is without these events being recorded for us. And so that's why we have that.
Steve, you've heard this. I'm sure most of us have. It applies to several situations in our society today. And people say, well, my God wouldn't do that. Or my God. And I want to ask the question, where'd you get your God? You didn't get it from the Bible, for sure.
Yeah.
They created their own image of God.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a problem. I think that's why God continues to talk to his people by saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And by making that statement, it goes back to all of these accounts. It goes back to, you remember who I am. That's who I am. And that's something we have to still remember today. But you're right. People they formed their own God in their own mind for what fits their life. And they don't really understand the importance of these type of things that God is doing, showing his justice and his authority. In chapter 19, beginning in verse 30, Lot's daughters, they do something pretty immoral and despicable themselves. So what do they do? They get their dad drunk, they get Lot drunk, they lay with him, and in an ending up bearing two sons. Now, because of this, there are two nations that are going to be born from these two sons. What are these two nations? Okay, you've got the Moabites. One of the sons is Moab, and you have Ammon. What's that?
And the sons of Ammon.
Yeah. And so you've got, and we're going to see these peoples later on. Who is one person in particular that usually comes to the top of the list when you think about the Moabites? Who was a Moabitess? Ruth. Yeah, it was Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth. Yep. And so we're going to see that come full circle back into the lineage of Christ later on as well. But a lot of these peoples that we're going to be hearing about later on, we're seeing their origin. We're seeing where they've come from, and which it's going to help answer a lot of questions later on. Genesis chapter 20. We're not really going We're not going to go over 20 very much. Abraham does what he has done before. This time with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. They come into the land where King Abimelech is, and Abraham lies about Sarah. Tell him you're my sister. We have that same thing that happened back in Egypt that takes place again. This time, God comes to Abimelech in a vision and rebukes Abimelech for taking Sarah because she is somebody else's wife. He comes back to Abraham and chastises him for what he does, and we have that same event happen again that we saw once before. It's a lesson that Abraham has not learned, and as we said, it's going to be something that's going to be passed on with his son later on. We're going to see this take place one more time with his son. And technically, we're not telling a lie because she is my half-sister. But I think that being a wife may have been maybe a more important thing to express. And again, we mentioned it the last time. I can't imagine in Sarah's mind, the culture was different. The place of women in that culture was different than what we see in our culture today. But still, as a human being, to be treated that way and almost just pawned off as, okay, you're not mine right now, it had to have been something. We know Sarah became very, very jealous and very, very emotional. We've already seen that. And so she was very human, and so you just kind of imagine what this did, even between their relationship, Abraham and Sarah. In chapter 21, the promise is fulfilled in chapter 21, and that promise is what? Isaac is born. So the birth of Isaac, Sarah has a son. In verse 5, how old was Abraham when his son was born? He's 100 years old. So when Abraham is born, when Isaac is born, Abraham's 100 years old. And we're going to look at, it begins to bring out the ages here a lot more. It's going to be significant. What problem begins to arise here? If you drop down to verse 9, there's a problem that comes up between Sarah and Hagar's sons. What initiates this problem? Okay, it could be jealousy. What's that? Yeah. Okay, right. At this point, you've got Ishmael, who is probably 12, 14 years old, somewhere around in there. And you have a small child, Isaac. And the older son, Ishmael, begins to make fun of Isaac. Sarah sees this, and Sarah is furious about this. And so Sarah then goes to Abraham and makes a request. Verse 10 of chapter 21, what request? What does Sarah ask Abraham to do? What's that? Yeah, drive them out. Would you force them, make them leave? And now, was he okay with this? No, he was not happy with it. And so this request, it bothered Abraham a lot. But in verses 12 and 13, there was some reassurance that God gave to Abraham. What did God tell Abraham? Okay, it's okay. You can go ahead and force them to leave. Why? Why is God saying that's okay? What does he tell him? Okay, he says that I am going to make Ishmael into a great nation. And so he is going to be successful. He is going to be taken care of. God is going to protect him. And what's that? He was Abraham's son. Yeah. What happens to Hagar and her son? Verses 14 through 21, it's a lot to go through. This section basically shows us that God provides for them, he protects them, and then the very end of the chapter, it tells us that Ishmael is also going to marry an Egyptian woman. And so this is the very beginning of a massive nation that is going to grow. A massive nation that still exists today, a lineage of people that still exist today. And they continue to bicker and fight together with Isaac's family, with the Jewish people. And so it's an incredible thing that we see that continues to happen, and it always has. God said that this battle would be something that would be happening forever. And so we see that being true. So Isaac has been born. We begin now to move into some of the events with Isaac and his sons, and so where are we at? Abraham has had this tremendous faith. It's been at least 25 years since God said, get up and leave your home. Go to a strange place you've never been, and take your whole family with you. Abraham trusted God, and he went. So many things along the way that Abraham has just by faith demonstrated, okay, I trust you. I'm going to believe you. And so at 100 years old, Isaac is born. And now, a few years later, what may be the most challenging test of Abraham's faith is now laid at his feet. And that's in Genesis chapter 22, verse 2. It says, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. I wish there was more said specifically of what was going on in Abraham's head right here. What it does say, I think, tells us a lot. Because what was Abraham's reaction when he heard this? He immediately did it. He begins to make preparations for the trip, and they leave. And there is not a single glimpse or a hint of hesitation. He doesn't question God at all. This one and only son that I have been waiting for so long, and finally I have him, and now you're telling me to go offer him as a sacrifice. Human sacrifice. That's nothing God has ever done before. And Abraham doesn't bat an eye. A faith that is beyond anything, I think beyond what I've ever experienced myself. If someone came, if God was telling me, okay, I want you to take your son and sacrifice your son, I'm telling you right now, I don't think there would be zero hesitation. This is such a challenging thing, and what we see in Abraham is such an amazing thing. And so this journey, verse 4, how does it describe how far this journey is to Mount Moriah? 3 days. Okay, so a 3-day journey. You can see it there. They're down here in Beersheba at the time, and Moriah is right here. What city is right there where Mount Moriah is? Salem. or Jerusalem. And so this sacrifice of Abraham's only begotten son is taking place right in the region of Jerusalem. And so we have a picture that's being painted here. What question does Isaac ask Abraham in verse 7? Where's the lamb? Where's the lamb for our sacrifice? Isaac is carrying the timber for the fire. He notices everything's here, but where's the lamb? And Abraham's answer is what in verse 8? It says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. I would love to know what that conversation was between then and when they get to the top of the mountain. I would really like to know now what's going on in Isaac's head, because I don't know that he yet has any idea that it's him, but he accepts the answer. They climb the mountain, and when they come to that place, Abraham tells him, basically lays him on the altar. And he's big enough and old enough to be carrying the firewood. On top of him or underneath him. And so he's a hefty enough kid. I have a 9-year-old that I don't know if I could get him to stay on an altar while I am raising a knife to take his life. Yeah. This long, it's a 3-day journey where as a young man, a young child, just having all the questions in his mind, the inquisitive mind of a child, of what is happening, what is going on. And we don't see any questioning here either. Was there any? I don't know. It doesn't show that there was. It shows Isaac trusting his father. It shows Isaac being one that is demonstrating the faith of his father. And so it's kind of an amazing event. But describe what happens when they arrive there, when Abraham is preparing to sacrifice Isaac. What happens? Okay, not just an angel, the angel of the Lord, it says again. The specific designation of the angel of the Lord in verse 11. And cries out to him, Abraham, Abraham. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. What future event is this a shadow of? It just shouts as a picture of the sacrifice of Jesus, of the lamb that will be provided by God, of the Father willing to sacrifice his only son, the son of promise. It's just saturated in a shadow of God and what he will do with Jesus. And what does it say? Well, I said that. It is the angel of the Lord who calls out to Abraham here. Now, what did the Lord say to Abraham? Look at verse 15 through 18. I think this is more toward verse 18. I think I put it up here. In verse 18, he says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. So again, Abraham has proven his faith, and God says because of that, every nation in the world is going to be blessed. Now, at this point, since we're talking about the angel of the Lord, this is a really good place to just take a look at it real quick. The angel of the Lord is Jehovah God. We see the conversation that's being had here in verse 12. Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God. Then verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. Now, Lord there you see is, in most of your translations, is in all caps. And when you see Lord in all caps, what is that? What do the translators designate by that? It's Jehovah. That whenever you see the Lord in all caps, it is Yahweh. It is Jehovah. And so the angel of the Lord is the one who is speaking. It says in verse 15, he's the one who is speaking to Abraham. And then in verse 16, the very next verse, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. The Jehovah himself is being, so the angel of the Lord and Jehovah are one and the same. And that pattern continues to be seen throughout the Old Testament when the angel of the Lord, not just an angel, but the angel of the Lord appears. And then there are also some links in the New Testament that Jesus uses. There's one in particular, one in John chapter 8, when they asked Jesus who he is. And Jesus' answer is, I am. Well, who was it that met Moses in the burning bush? It was the angel of the Lord. It was Jehovah God that was speaking to Moses at the burning bush. And Jesus is the one in John chapter 8 who claims, I am. He was claiming to be the one that was speaking to Moses in the bush. He knew that's what the Jews would recognize that to be. And did the Jews recognize that Jesus was claiming to be that God? The very next verse says they picked up stones to stone him because they thought he was blaspheming. And so it's an amazing connection with the angel of the Lord. There's so many things I don't know and understand about it, but there's just enough that God gives us to see a connection that's being made, and it's pretty remarkable. We'll pick up there on Sunday morning in Genesis 23. It's primarily the death of Sarah and just some of the things that take place with Abraham right just following her death.